2012. Okay.
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this fourth lecture in this series on the coming 2026 financial and economic crisis. One of the things I wanted to mention, I thought I should at least make a comment about. If you have noticed, I jump around in this series of lectures chronologically. And what I've been trying to do is show that there's a correlation with what happened in the major depression of the 1930s and that of what happened after 2008, and how some of the conditions that existed in those two most serious economic contractions are important because they acted in such a similar way. And now we're getting into a discussion more and more about what has been the societal reaction to those conditions. And certainly in the 1930s, the New Deal in the United States was a major societal reaction. Something had to be done. There had to be a level of governmental intervention that made some people very uncomfortable. And even today, we know are making many people, particularly on the right, uncomfortable about the level of intervention by government in economic and private affairs. So this struggle isn't new. This struggle for the hearts and minds of people over what the role of the state ought to be and how much interference there ought to be in the economy, and also what constitutes justice, what constitutes the right balance between protecting property rights and protecting human rights. And then you get into this debate, of course, we have of what are property rights? What is property? And then what are our human rights? We still haven't come to a strong consensus on those issues. Those on the left, on the progressives left, agree within their own subgroup, and on the right there tends to be agreement with that subgroup, but not universally. And so and I think that's something we have to recognize as part of the problem. Whether we will ever be able to overcome that problem, I don't know. It's behavioral, it's psychological, it's ideological. But the best that we can do, the best that I can do, is to try to provide an analysis that is based on facts and evidence and analysis as best I can. So last week, I left off talking a little bit about what the New Deal brought into play. And in the financial sector, one of the big improvements was federal deposit insurance. That was offered in 1934. And once people became confident that when they went to the bank, they could get the money that they had deposited, and that the bank would not be declared insolvent and the doors closed, then the money went back into the banks. And so the stability in the financial sector, gradually improved, and it remained pretty stable until the period of the 1970s, when we experienced stagflation. And then in the early 1970s, the first money market mutual funds were established. And eventually, it was the availability of individuals with a relatively low amount of savings to take money out of their corner savings and loan or savings association and put it into the money market mutual funds that caused havoc with that part of the financial sector. And so when millions and then billions of dollars started to move from the S&Ls, the thrifts, into money market mutual funds, we set the stage for the S&L crisis that occurred. And once that occurred, we saw another period of major closings of financial institutions. And so I left you with this chart last week just to show, the peak of how beginning in the early 1980s and up through the early 1990s, the number of bank failures just, skyrocketed as compared to, as you can see along here, almost nothing from the early 1940s up through the mid 1970s. So a major change. And it wasn't until somewhat later that any kind of legislative relief came to the S&Ls, which allowed them to compete with the money market mutual funds in terms of issuing certificates of deposit to draw money back in. And in the meantime, since they were bleeding red, many of those thrifts took on more risky business. They started to make loans to commercial developers. And many of them had no expertise in that kind of lending. And so a lot of the loans that they made were not well underwritten and went into default. There are many cases where the members of the bank's board were provided with financing for projects that they undertook that went sour. And so many S&Ls continued to fail. In 1983, the thrifts and commercial banks were able then to compete with money market mutual funds, and other reforms took place. There was a major beginning of deregulation and removal of restrictions on interstate branch banking. So now with this possibility, some of the major banks could expand across state lines. They could begin acquiring other institutions. In your city, if you're in the United States, you may remember how many times a banking institution was changing its name. The local bank turned into, some larger entity, local, and then it was bought out by some larger international bank, and maybe the next sign it was put on it was Wells Fargo or HSBC. So just to give you an idea of how fast that occurred, when I started working at Fannie Mae, we did about 80% of our business volume with about 300 lending institutions, mortgage banking companies, commercial banks, thrifts, et cetera. When I retired in 2005, 80% of our volume came from 8 firms. So that gives you a sense of the kind of financial consolidation that was occurring in the US financial markets. So all this is going on, and then we get a new figure in the picture. In 1987, Alan Greenspan is appointed by Ronald Reagan as the new chair of the Federal Reserve Board. And he basically is a free market guy. He believes that the banks are smart enough to really run their own affairs, and that he really doesn't have to lean on them or watch over much of what they're doing. Well, he remains in office in that position during the administrations of 4 presidents. And it's under Greenspan's leadership that the Federal Reserve also began to cut back on interest rates. And that seems like a good thing to do, because lower the interest rates and that makes credit more available. More people can qualify for loans. More businesses are going to seek capital, financial capital, to invest and expand. But there's another outcome to this. With each cut in interest rates, the number of potential property buyers that are able to qualify to carry higher and higher levels of mortgage debt increases. And the markets, not by any collusion or anything, the markets capitalize this debt carrying capacity into higher land and property prices. So these charts show you exactly what happens. Beginning with the reduction of interest rates, just naturally house prices increase, as do rents on apartment buildings, apartments. If you're, excuse me. If you're living in an apartment today, I think, was it Gil, you said last week, it's $4,000 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, or somebody gave that statistic. So rents have climbed up, not quite as fast as housing prices, but a lot of this is because people have been able to carry higher and higher levels of debt. Well, that gets people into housing, but then what happens if there's a recessionary downturn? Now the median level of debt per household that's purchased a property during this period of rising prices is way up there. So instead of you falling behind on a $150,000 loan, you've fallen behind on a $300,000 or $400,000 loan. And you're now potentially lost income. And so when you are evicted and foreclosure occurs, now the holder of that debt has collateral that may be dropping significantly in value. And so the potential for the average loss per loan dramatically increases as well. So all of this plays into where we are in these cycles. And so when I talk about reaching a level of maximum stress, that's part of what I'm talking about. With the property prices climbing as they do, it creates just a higher and higher level of stress. If anything goes wrong, then the aggregate effect of everything going wrong is going to be more crisis oriented. And which means that if government is going to intervene to stem the losses, they're going to have to intervene in even a greater way. So think about what happened after 2008. We saw the greatest financial intervention by any governments anywhere at any time. And the question is, what's going to happen in 2026, perhaps, if the same dynamic occurs, but the aggregate level of debt that's out there that's going to be at risk is going to be, multiples of what it was even in 2008. So by the time Greenspan leaves office in 2005, the nation's property markets were fast approaching that point of maximum stress. And then what would naturally have occurred was further aggravated because of the rise of the subprime mortgage loans. As I was looking at loan volume in the early 2000s, it was just dramatic, the percentage of the market that was being captured by these subprime mortgage loans. And those of us who were looking at the quality of the credit, we were able to see clearly that a lot of it was fraudulent. It just, buyers of property who would be asked to fill out a loan application, and whatever income they put down, that's what the mortgage originator would qualify for them at. No attempts to verify their employment, no attempts to verify their income, maybe run a credit report, and if their credit scores met what was required, they got the financing. And a fair number of these buyers were doing this not because they wanted to acquire shelter for long term, but they fully anticipated being able to flip the property in a year or two to somebody else and walk away with a capital gain. But eventually these markets, again, reach a stress that will no longer allow for increased passing on of the increased cost. And so by 2007, they pretty much had maxed out, and a lot of the data was already coming in that the loans that were made to secure these private label mortgage-backed securities were defaulting at rates 2 or 3 times higher than conventional loans. And basically the investment market all of a sudden looked at mortgage-backed securities and said, no more. we're now not going to invest in these mortgage-backed securities any longer. And so not only did the securities originated under the subprime market conditions start to lose value, but the mortgage-backed securities issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were still performing well, they also lost value. So if you're an investor holding one of those securities and you needed cash, you weren't likely to get 100% on the dollar. You're going to have to take a hit because the market is valuing those bonds not as AAA bonds any longer, but something with a higher level of risk. So in the face of all this, what did we get? Well, we got the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act signed by Obama in 2010. And one part of the bill increased deposit insurance to $250,000, which would give a lot of depositors confidence that if they needed to pull money out of the bank, that their bank would still be in existence, or if their bank went under, they would get their whatever they had on deposit back. Now, here's what's interesting about this. The Federal Reserve reported in 2019 that the median combined checking and savings account balance of a U.S. household was $5,300. The average balance was just $41,600. So this was a measure increasing the protection to $250,000 that was designed really to protect who? Those really in the top maybe 10% of the population. It still was needed, but certainly it protected most those who could afford to lose the most. Those who didn't have much, well, they were protected as well, but it also created, and this is the thing with deposit insurance, when the depositors are protected, it gives the bankers reason to take greater risk because they don't have to worry as much about losing deposits. And so too many bankers began to take risk in search of higher yields. And so we don't know where that all stands today because we haven't really run into the financial crisis yet, even though we're now in the early stages of this recession. So going back to the 30s, I thought it might be useful to see what was being said back then. This chart, oh yeah, let me make a comment on this. This chart shows the outcome of failed banks since 2008. And so what it means is there have been some failures, even with the intervention by the federal government and the tightened stress tests that are imposed on banks. So because of that, 465 banks were closed by the FDIC between 2008 and 2012. So how many more are at risk? I haven't been able to find any current statistics on, but I suspect that certainly some are who haven't really tightened their underwriting standards, and they're. I mean, this is a problem with the financial competition is that everyone's competing for the highest quality borrowers, and so there's this tendency then for the borrowers, the potential borrowers, to say, if you don't give me the deal that I want, I'll go to some other institution and get it. And so the banks, in order to keep up their market share, their transaction volume, some of them will take on higher risk than they should. So at the height of the collapse in the 1930s, John Maynard Keynes raised some very fundamental questions that are still relevant to today. Could I get a volunteer to read? It's always been painful for someone to step forward, but would someone like to volunteer? No? All right. Well, I will read then. Keynes said, can we prevent an almost complete collapse of the financial structure of modern capitalism? With no financial leadership left in the world and profound intellectual error as to causes and cures prevailing in the responsible sets of power, one begins to wonder and to doubt. Now, whether the policies that Keynes embraced would have significantly mitigated the effects of the Great Depression, I think is still arguable, because Keynes failed to recognize the dynamics of the property markets as a key driver of economic cycles. If you look through his writings, he has very little to say about the power of the property class, and he tended to think of land markets as limited to the agricultural and natural resource markets, and didn't really see, the fact that the most valuable land in the world is the center of financial districts. And I don't have any explanation for why he was so blind to that. Maybe someone else who has studied Keynes's writings has some insight into that. Well, at the end of 1983, an open letter by Keynes to Franklin Roosevelt appeared in the New York Times. And in this letter came the advice later to become the basis for the Keynesian revolution and the idea of demand management. Keynes wrote in here, he says, as the prime mover in the first stage of the technique of recovery, I lay overwhelming emphasis on the increase of national purchasing power resulting from governmental expenditure, which is financed by loans and is not merely a transfer through taxation from existing incomes. What he's basically arguing for is that it's better for government to issue bonds and take on the debt than to increase taxes. Does he make any distinction here between the fact of who should be paying taxes, what parts of the economy should be taxed and others unburdened by taxation? No, he really doesn't make that distinction. So we have, in the form of Keynes, one of the most respected economists of that era, calling upon government to borrow from those with monetary assets rather than requiring the wealthy to pay taxes sufficient to meet the financial needs of government. So government should borrow from those who have, and the government should pay interest on that borrowing, the interest obtained by taxation of others. And that's considered to be a reasonable financial approach to balancing the government budget. Well, conventional in much of his thinking, Keynes never considered authorizing government to use its sovereign power to create and directly inject money into circulation independent of debt issuance. Nothing that I can find in his writing suggested that he had any inclination that what the MMT analysts are arguing was something that government ought to consider. And I suspect that he was probably very much afraid of inflation, but others who have advocated for the ability of government to simply print money and spend it into circulation have argued, perhaps not persuasively to you, or maybe more persuasively to me, that it's possible to do so without triggering inflation. Maybe someone has a thought about that as well. Anyone have an opinion? Joe?
I can take a stab at that if you want.
Okay, Ibrahim, I'll let you go first, and then we'll go to Joe after you.
Okay, so it's not necessarily something that I'm deriving from MMT, but there is an economist, a German economist that is, I think is teaching in England. His name is Richard Werner. He wrote the book, Princes of the Yen. He said the distinction is to be made between credit that is for consumption and credit that is for production. So the one that we should be worrying about is when credit is extended just for consumption and not enough credit is extended for production. So that imbalance between the two is really what we should worry about, because that's generates inflation.
Well, giving people government spending money into circulation isn't extending credit. It's giving them purchasing power immediately. So we did that to get through the pandemic. We did that after 2008, but mostly it went into the banks and other corporate entities. So, here again, there is a distinction about what credit is used for, no doubt. And the higher risk of losses occurs with credit that is offered to consumers, particularly when it's not well underwritten. But I should have let you finish your point.
Yeah, he make also a second point. He says he gives the example of countries like Japan, and that's true for South Korea, because Adair Turner's book, Between Debt and the Devil, makes a good case for it. That basically when the government spends the money into the economy, like we witnessed in 2007 and 2008, there was no prescription on how that money should be spent. So we believe that the financial markets are efficient, and if they get some credit injection, they know really well where to allocate that credit. And what happened just show that that's basically not a theory that really makes sense, because most of them held on to the money. What the government was expecting did not happen. So if we had credit guidance, as Werner theorized, perhaps the recovery would have taken a lot less time.
Joe.
Yeah, I like those comments, Ibrahim. That's a good observation. As far as Keynes himself is concerned, I'd make a few points. One, Keynes is famous for saying, whatever we can do, we can afford, which is a clever reversal of the classical types who say we can only do what we can afford. And that suggests an awareness of the fact that the money itself is just a legal mechanism to mobilize what we do. Second thing he said was in that letter to Roosevelt, he said, and I'll quote, or public authority must be called in to aid to create additional current incomes through the expenditure of borrowed or printed money. A third thing I would mention is that Keynes was with the Bank of England in 1914 when there was a little talked about financial dual crisis, really. It was very nicely chronicled in a book called Saving the City. Don't know if anybody's familiar with that one, but it's a superb book by Professor Robertson, I think his name was. And in that, they talk about the fact that there was a financial crisis before the war, and the Bradburys were developed. He was the treasurer, whatever they call the treasurer in England. And
the Chancellor of the Exchequer, do you mean?
There you go, the Exchequer, right. And they actually, they were on the gold standard at the time, and they more or less suspended it, officially or not, and they produced these non-backed bills called Bradburys, signed by him. And Keynes would have seen all that, right? And when the war did start, they could not raise enough money to fight it. So
Right.
guess where the money came from? He saw the Bank of England and the Treasury work together to buy the war bonds to finance the war. So I think there's enough evidence to say that Keynes was aware of these things and was kind of wary to support them much. But I do think he did have knowledge and expertise in these things. I know he wasn't keen. He didn't, come out in big support for the Chicago Plan or Lerner's approach. But I think it was there in the background.
Thank you for that, Joe. That improves my perception of how Keynes was thinking about reacting to the Great Depression. So thanks. Marty, Roland.
Yeah, and good class. So I wanted to point out that although Henry George is not seen as giving a lot of insight on money and its use, he often cites the analogy of the flywheel. And I think kind of supporting what Ibrahim was talking about is that being a productive use of money or wealth is an example of the flywheel, that you're putting something in motion that can further the economy. So that's one thing that wanted to point out. But
Well, Marty, what would, if you were the equivalent to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and you were allowed to create new money for specific purposes, what would your priorities be to infuse the money into the economy?
Well, you can always point to what FDR did. I guess he saw war on the horizon, so he put money into the airplanes and those kind of military things. But he also looked at dams and electricity and rural electrification, because once you electrify something, you're building up the economy and getting some density of wealth. So
yeah, so infrastructure development does create jobs, puts money in the pocket of workers, and the workers can then spend it, on what they need in their daily lives. And so you have, velocity of money occurring, and you get something concrete, some tangible public capital goods created in the process. And to me, that would seem like the right approach if we are in fact going to adopt the approach recommended by the MMT analysts with regard to money creation.
yeah, that's great. Appreciate the comment. Thanks.
Michael, how are you this evening?
I'm well. I've had a very busy day. I've been up since 6 o'clock this morning. This is about a 10th meeting I've been to, but I won't go into that. I'm feeling anyway. What I want to put into the mix, Ed, is it seems to be, we're here in London, a new phenomenon is the cost of living crisis that's ready to hit us in around October, where gas and electricity bills will be doubling basically overnight in October. Once the summer, we don't spend much on heating at the moment because it's quite warm, but it's really going to hit because that's planned. Now, is that a new phenomenon that should be addressed? In fact, people are having to ask or demand higher wage settlements to meet that. It's not about getting handouts so much, because that's what's been described, but that they're trying to do it on their own back by demanding higher wages. So it's shifting the balance of power between the worker, if I could use that expression, and the employer and the employer. So it's a new phenomenon, a new way of doing it, a new strategy that's come up, and we shouldn't ignore that, because it's as destructive as the other one of pouring too much money and creating far too much inflation. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is in the United States, it's led to the resurgence of the trades union movement that's given union organizers a lot more ammunition to bring workers into the unions. That's one thing. The other thing is more personal, and that is that there's a lot of businesses now created in the United States that are advertising better insulation for your homes, or put solar panels on your house and sell electricity back to the utilities. So there's practical issues that practical ways people can reduce the cost of energy. And certainly, one aspect of this is the extent to which people are able to work remotely rather than have to travel into the city to work. And hopefully if they have to travel into the city from their home, they have access to public transportation, which greatly reduces their cost of transportation. I actually heard something else on the news just an hour ago on BBC America, where the news commentator was talking about the Biden plan to forgive student college debt. And she gave us a statistic that said that the average debt per student in the UK is twice as high as it is in the United States.
And China, in this country, China is able to pay £14,000 fees, etc., whereas students in this country are expected to pay 9,000. So obviously the colleges require more funds, and they're taking more overseas visitor students because they can pay higher fees. The lower fees for resident people in this country it's too much for them to pay unless they've got the bank of mum and dad, etc., to actually finance them. But I think it's a new way, a new pressure. That's why I'm trying to reflect upon it.
Yeah. Well, people are going to have to make, some people are going to have to make hard decisions about lifestyle choices. I mean, one of the changes in households in the United States is the return of the multi-generation house. So you have more and more families coming together to share expenses because it's too expensive for them to live on their own. So
this is the sort of movement in itself. We've been focused a little bit on the inflation and borrowing. I'm reminded of the famous phrase, neither a borrower nor a lender be, etc. But the fact that Keynes wasn't interested in creating money, he was stressing borrowing from people who had plenty and therefore can reap a golden harvest by lending their money at exorbitant rates, etc. So it's a completely different force, really, in the community, and I think it's I really do think it's personified in the cost of living crisis, that people who want to be independent, don't want to be have their hand out all the time, they want to pay their own way, that they're having to increase their position in the community. They're having to increase their market share of the great pot that's available.
Well, I mean, I just gave you some statistics on household savings in the United States that clearly indicates that a large percentage of the households here in this country could not survive on their savings, on what they've been able to put away from their incomes, and
their only recourse really is to try and increase their wages, etc. And that probably has another another set of difficulties that might arise from that. I mean, that, you know, you've read probably in your country about the train strikes, which and people working from home is not really working. They've really got to get back in their offices. They're more efficient in their offices than they might think they're better off, but it's that the service is terrible.
I just want to make one comment. I think it's really important. We've gone to a discussion of a lot of very specific conditions that exist right now and that have been building to a head.
Yeah.
None of this obviates the existence of the recurring economic cycle that, you know, has existed for several centuries, and on average is this 18.5 years. It's like everything we do, good or bad, to strengthen, weaken, you know, different segments of the economy, none of it has worked to stabilize this or minimize the impact of this cycle in any effective way. And the reason I would argue, and some others are arguing, is we've never addressed the systemic cause. We've never addressed the fact that our societies are dominated by rent seeking and by landed privilege.
Yeah.
Joffrey.
You extract the rentier economy. People are taking money out of a pot that they have power to do so. And then I agree with you, unless we can change that, you know, you're going to get back to the basics, but identifying the real basics and then following that up with legislation in government or wherever is, and how the nation, the population can change its mind, because everyone wants to get on the poverty ladder because there is this golden reward for once you're on there and safely on there, you know, you're seemingly okay, which is,
well, the key to there was being safely on there, and not everyone remains safely on there, as we experience every time there's a property crash.
Okay.
Joffrey.
Thank you. I want it's a very exciting discussion you're having, and I wanted to call attention to an economist that John Maynard Keynes himself was singled out, Silvio Gesell, in his classic on general theory. He mentions him by name, and Silvio Gesell was also inspired by Henry George, and his ideas were applied in Virgil, Austria, in the early 1930s, which turned around the economy of the city of Michael Unterguggenberger, one of the disciples of Silvio Gesell. Other cities were about to follow suit until the Central Bank of Austria cracked down on the town, and prohibited the continued practice of spending money into existence. They created their own currency. And the first thing they did was create currencies to pay wages for jobs and welfare payments. And eventually it expanded to spending money into existence to maintain and even build new infrastructure. Now I take exception to a dogma that all money is credit. That's not true. I mean, when you pay a loan, the loan disappears. But when you pay with money, the money is still there. And I think we need to re-examine the equations of monetary theory. Henry George was on the money until, unfortunately, he did not finish book 5, which is on money. And I think that Silvio Gesell followed through with the ideas of Henry George. And I tend to believe that that economic rents are monetized because when banks lend money into existence, what's their favorite collateral? It's land values. So the key really is monetizing the land values to serve the interests and needs of society, and not for banks to make money out of it. That's all I have to contribute. Thank you.
Well, perhaps that's what we will eventually get to if the movement to create public banks is successful. And, you know, the purpose of public banks will be very different from that of commercial banks in this country or any country. So it's to be seen what kind of reforms can be pushed through given the influence of the financial sector over legislative matters. It's been said in the United States that there are more lobbyists from the American Bankers Association in Washington than there are legislators. Joe.
I put the link to Saving the City. The author did a magazine article which nicely summarized his book, and it's a really fascinating little read about something that if the United States had imitated at the beginning of the Great Depression, they probably could have completely avoided it. And
well, are you referring to the Chicago plan there? Is that what you mean?
No, the Saving the City was just was the response to the 1914 financial crisis.
Oh, okay, okay,
England, et cetera. And as I mentioned earlier, and really is very similar to what we did in 2008, 2020. So,
and what was the author's name?
I think it's Robertson, Professor Robertson. It's in the. I put it in. The link is there, and it's by him.
Okay.
And the second thing I just wanted to mention that Marty said something about Keynes mentioning land when you were talking about what Keynes thought about land, and he mentioned that it was mentioned 8 times in his book. So I wonder if Marty has anything to say about Keynes's view on land. Thank you.
Well, Marty, you're on the spot. Do you have anything you want to add? Well, we'll get back to that. I mean, in reading the general theory and Keynes' essays on persuasion and some of his other writings, it seemed to me that he paid minimal attention to the operation of land markets. And he really seemed to be focused. He seemed to be captured by Ricardo and not thinking more modernly about the role of land markets in an economy. But that's my conclusion based on my reading. So let me say that, if you critique Henry Keynes as Henry George might have, it seems that Keynes gave no thought that I can find of distinguish between income earned by producing goods and services and income that was derived from speculating in land and other rent-seeking privileges. If he had really focused on that, he might have come up with a system of progressive taxation that would have increasingly captured rent-derived income than what the normal progressive income tax system in any country seems to do. So I think, as government policies conform to what Keynes argued should be done, short-run stability was achieved at the cost of long-run crises. That's my view of the impact of Keynesian thinking. The cause of economic cycles remained untouched, and much has been said. It's been made of what Keynes wrote actually in 1923, and back then he said, of course, in the long run we were all dead. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again. So he's criticizing his own discipline, but I think from too narrow a perspective of how he thinks, you can tell that the storm is coming. Now, one of the American economists who challenges Keynes was an economist who followed Henry George much more closely, and his name was Harry Gunnison Brown. And he raised merit in 1951. He began to write in challenging the Keynesian demand management theories and proposals by trying to remind economists of how the world really worked. So he writes, why do the writers in question consistently and persistently ignore the fact that some have to pay others for permission to work on and live on the earth in those locations where work is reasonably effective and life reasonably tolerable? So Harry Gunnison Brown is bringing up the most fundamental issue. Why is it that some people have to pay others for the privilege of using the earth? And he goes on, why do they always, or practically always, turn their attention to heavy taxation of incomes that are not at all exploitative, but are fairly earned by service given? Why do they thus, while stressing compulsory charity, insist on overlooking the fundamental requirements of justice? And finally, he says, why must they forever stress taxation that tends to weaken capitalist incentive or motivation, and so make the free private enterprise system work less effectively, even if such taxation does not so far interfere with its successful operation as to completely discredit it and cause its ultimate abandonment? For Brown, policies that democratic societies arguing for capitalism and pursuing were going to bring the system to an ultimate crash. I mean, this is what Richard Wolff is talking about today. The weaknesses in in the so-called capitalist system. You know, he points out week to week in his podcasts, and if you listen to him, he's absolutely right. But he doesn't really point to the real problem.
Yeah.
We don't have a capitalist system, in my view. We've never had a capitalist system. If by capitalism we mean that nearly all, or at least an overwhelming majority of individuals and households derive a significant portion of income by the ownership of capital goods. We've never had that. We don't have it now. We have a system that's built on landlordism, but it is a system that very few economists, other than those who have studied Henry George, acknowledge. So it's a real challenge to figure out, how do we get economists to take the lead, to pay attention to what is actually going on? Harry Gunnison Brown wrote textbooks. A few other economists have done so. Fred Foldvari has done so. There's a little bit of interest, but not enough to move the mountain. And that's the challenge. Marty, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what Joe mentioned. So the reason I mentioned that Keynes mentions land 8 times, because that was something that I read in Brian Hodgkinson's book, the book that I'm teaching this year. And the point was really just to underscore what point you made, is that he didn't really have a good understanding of land, that he would use land so few times in a book. So it's a pretty good guess that you were on the right track.
Okay, thanks for that, Marty. Gail.
I have a question, actually. I'd like to know whether or not you see the work of Thomas Piketty, I should say, is capitalism in the 21st century, where the fundamentals boil down to R always exceeds G. In other words, rate of return rents always exceed growth. Is his analysis, I think, is very much along this of the lines of this new appreciation of the rentier, which has been triggered by the financialization, so that it's not just fixed property, right, but nominal property as well, that extracts rents, that has blossomed back into control over production.
in my view, Piketty deserves a lot of credit for bringing these issues to the fore
Right.
and stimulating, additional analysis and research. But I don't think, I think it's fair to criticize Piketty at this point for still not quite getting it. And perhaps some of his more recent writings focus on an analysis of property markets, but I don't know, because I haven't spent the time to try to update on what he's been writing.
No, his primary focus is on the distribution of wealth and income. So it
But
has.
here's the point that I'm getting at.
Yes. And what of Michael Hudson's work?
Well, I know Michael well, and I would say that Michael, his analysis was more closely tied to what economists who embrace Henry George were likely to say. Although I do have some dispute with Michael over a couple issues, and one is that he argues that all financial interest is rent, and I don't believe that that's true, but it's a long discussion that would be required for us to get into that. But so I think I take Michael much more seriously as understanding the core issues. Whether or not he chooses to put the time to explain to the public what those issues really are and what they mean is a different issue. With Piketty, I think he just doesn't yet realize the power of property markets, and particularly the power of land markets, and the failure of communities and society to capture rent to pay for public goods and services.
Thank you.
And perhaps other economists who do realize it, somebody like Joe Stiglitz, maybe Stiglitz will eventually, or others who have finally come to that realization will begin to have more impact on what Piketty writes about and does research to substantiate. Yeah, I mean, what I have this next slide up here just deals with this in a very direct way. Is America's tax system fair? So just think about it. When a government borrows, one part of the policy choice is who ought to be taxed in order to raise at least a portion of the revenue necessary to service the debt. MMT argues that such taxes are appropriate to achieve social policy objectives, but are not necessary to meet the revenue needs of government. So if a social policy objective is a redistribution of income from those who obtain income by privilege and rent seeking, then it ought to be progressive up at the higher levels, because that's where most of the rent derived income and gains is obtained. Not all of it, but most of it. So I come down on the side of imposing a high rate of taxation on this income that is unearned. If some earned income is also captured at the highest levels of income, well, I accept this as a modest price to pay for systemic reform in the direction of fairness and equity. And, if, for example, professional athletes that earn multi-million-dollar incomes every year, it's earned income, but they can certainly afford to be taxed at a higher rate at that higher level of income than the overwhelming majority of people who earn income by doing other things. Others might disagree that it's unfair to impose a higher rate of taxation on them because they've earned the income. But we do have these issues of what's fair to deal with. Governments also raise revenue by leasing part of the public domain out to private interests. So, here's a couple volumes that deal with some of this. Only rarely do the fees collected represent the full potential rental value of these locations or resource-laden tracts of land? The government, at least in the United States, whether it's a state government or federal government, doesn't seem to be too diligent in reassessing the leasehold value of the assets that public assets are leased to private interest. And so what happens in the marketplace is that when the nominal ground rent charge is less than what it should be, the difference is a gain that can be capitalized into a leasehold value. So for example, if I'm a rancher and I have a government lease to graze my animals on 1 million acres of land, and the difference between what I pay the government and what the government ought to collect is $1 million. And a market rate of return is 10%, then I could essentially sell my lease, not sell the land, but sell my lease to someone else, if government permits me, for $10 million, even though I don't even own the land. And that's part of one of the issues that the government needs to clean up. And if it's going to more effectively collect the full value of the public domain that is leased out to private interests. The same thing occurs with most other natural assets, such as the allocation of frequencies on the broadcast spectrum. Most of these licenses were acquired at a nominal cost. And only since 1994 has the FCC, that's the Federal Communications Commission, auctioned off licenses for what were available frequencies. So the winning bidder obtains the right to use the spectrum freely once they pay the fee, as long as they adhere to the guidelines and standards, and there are no annual rents paid to the government to retain the license. If that company decides that they no longer want to broadcast, they can then sell that license for whatever the market will bear. That value ought to be captured fully by the government. At best, it's going to be captured as a percentage of the gain that's reported under the income tax system, the business profits tax. So we have a very complex tax system that tends to favor rent-seeking behavior, favor those entities that are able to gain some sort of level of privilege under the tax system, and for individuals as well. Now, some states and the federal government do capture land rent in the form of royalties on the amount of oil and natural gas extracted. And so here's just a chart showing you the royalty rates imposed by different states and by the federal government. So we are getting what amounts to some percentage of the rents based on those royalty taxes. How much lower are these than they ought to be? I don't know, but I suspect they're considerably lower than they ought to be in some locations, based on, for example, what is the comparative cost of extraction? How much technology does it take to pull oil and natural gas out of locations in Texas versus North Dakota? So one has to take into consideration the all-in cost of doing that business. Now, what we know is that record profits for the major oil and gas companies have been recorded lately. And this indicates that the rents charged to the oil companies are far below what would be captured if there was ongoing competitive bidding for access. And again, are these companies paying their fair share in terms of tax revenue? Are they benefiting by special privileges under state or federal law? In other countries, the same issues, exist. During 2021, the federal government took in nearly $3.5 trillion in revenue. Half of this came from individual income taxes, as you can see in this chart. The tax structure, of course, is progressive, so that the taxes paid by the top 1% equaled about 20% of the total paid. Note that the corporate income taxes amounted to just 7% of the total. And that's what's a big political issue right now in the United States. The Biden administration, and under the new tax laws, is trying to get that up to a minimum of 15%. What will that do to companies? Will they move their facilities offshore in order to escape the taxation? That certainly is a possibility. So here you have conflicting policies. You want to increase business activity in the country, but if you impose higher taxes, it may make it beneficial to move your production facilities offshore, if you can, to a different labor source, a different administrative governmental regime. And then you have to deal as a business with what, if any, are going to be the restrictions of exporting your foreign production back into the United States, and then how will it be taxed? For those in other countries, this is why we have the largest number of lawyers per capita in the world, and probably the largest number of accountants per capita in the world as well. We have a lot of people working, on how to figuring out how to minimize tax obligations, minimizing how to comply with federal and state and local regulations, and still maximize profits. The system we have is far too complicated, and we really need to think about streamlining it, but doing so in a way that nurtures the right parts of our economy to produce, and puts restrictions on those portions of our economy that ought to be restricted. Jim Frederickson.
Earlier in the discussion, two names were mentioned, Thomas Piketty and Joe Stiglitz. I thought you might be interested in a comment that Stiglitz had about Thomas Piketty when he was asked, what is new in your recent work on the distribution of income and wealth among individuals? This was an interview that took place in 2014. Stiglitz said the following: there's some debate about this, but I think most readers of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, get the impression that the accumulation of wealth or savings is responsible for the rise in inequality, and that there is therefore, in a way, a link between the growth of the economy, the accumulation of capital on the one hand, and inequality and wealth. My paper, that is Stiglitz's paper, begins with the observation that, in fact, you cannot explain what happened to the wealth-income ratio by that analysis. A closer look at what has gone on suggests that a large fraction of the increase in wealth is an increase in the value of land, not in the amount of capital goods.
There's probably nothing more to say. I mean, the question is Piketty listening to this, and will it affect his future research? And hopefully what Stiglitz is doing is stimulating the interest of younger economists who might be less wedded to what they learned while they were pursuing their PhDs or completing their dissertations. They might be willing to challenge the discipline's failure to really deal with the land market dynamic. And that would be, I think, a blessing for the advice that government elected officials would be getting if that could possibly happen. I would be happy if they would want to listen to me, but I can't even get my local mayor to listen to me. So the long-term, thank you for that, James, by the way. The long-term trend here is is a steady decline, not in dollars paid in taxes, but in the percentage share of GDP that comes from corporate income taxes. And again, the question is that what should happen? Or is there another way that businesses should be charged, should pay taxes? And not later in the course, hopefully we'll get to an idea that I believe has merit, that has not really been thoroughly analyzed, but has some practical real world application. And that is moving away from business profits taxation to a graduated tax on gross revenue. Just put that as a placeholder for now, rather than get into any discussion about it. So here's another graph that tells us about what's happening with cities. I mean, arguably, sound tax policies would allow these cities to retire their debt, to balance their budgets, and also allocate funds for, let's say, state-of-the-art public infrastructure and improve the amenities that people would like to have. But municipalities are not sovereign currency issuers. Perhaps they would like to be, like was done in Austria or was done in Chicago until the federal government intervened back in the Depression era. But municipalities can't do that, at least none have tried that I'm aware of. So the revenue has to come from property located within their borders, from their residents, the businesses operating there, and people employed there, but who may live elsewhere. If that doesn't produce enough revenue to balance their budget, then they have to depend upon revenue sharing from the state and the federal government in the United States. Bottom line is, almost no municipal governments have figured out the key to balancing budgets while creating the right climate for non-inflationary full employment. Only a few have come a little close by adopting a two-rate property tax and beginning to, shift the burden of taxation away from capital improvements and onto, land values. In the United States, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, this practice is most prevalent in Pennsylvania, where I guess about 20 towns and boroughs and cities have adopted a two-rate property tax structure, as well as a couple school districts. And the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, has had a two-rate property tax for probably now 40 years, since sometime in the 1970s. And the city imposes a rate of taxation on assessed land values 6 times greater than that imposed on its buildings. And Harrisburg has had considerable good result with this bit of tax reform. The other thing that we have to think about, of course, is what we've been talking about. Property taxes are a large source of state and local tax revenue. And so if we're not taxing property appropriately, we have inefficient and somewhat destructive results. Too heavy taxes on property improvements, and we get fewer property improvements. Too low taxes on holding land, and we get a lot of land speculation and land hoarding. And so those are counterproductive outcomes that the tax policies that are in place in many places are causing. And they contribute to economic instability and to the economic cycles that keep recurring. So we get back to monetary policy a bit here again. You have intergovernmental revenue coming from the federal government over the last 4 decades, which has been made possible only by debt-based monetary expansion, meaning that in the United States, the federal government has been issuing bonds, treasuries, and those treasuries have been purchased with money created out of thin air by the Federal Reserve banks. And then that money gets spent into circulation, but the US government has debt that it has to pay. And so part of the revenue being raised by taxation and by other means is going to pay the interest on the debt. Again, on money created out of thin air. It's more complicated than that as well. Some of you may know that under the law, the Federal Reserve banks have a maximum profit rate. I think it's 5 or 6%. So anything above that, they return to the US Treasury. So what the net cost to the US government is in terms of interest on the debt is much reduced by the fact that as the Fed makes a profit, the Treasury gets a lot of that money back. The MMT analysts observe, of course, that this debt could be eliminated with a few keystrokes on the government's computer. And hopefully this could be done without much danger that it would fuel inflation or that it would create some serious problems with removing the debt and replacing that in the hands of with cash in the hands of the bondholders. So right now, what we have is investors investing in government securities. They don't have that cash available. The bonds are paid off. Now they have that cash available. What are they going to do with it if they're not going to be able to invest in government securities because MMT is in place? Well, the prices of corporate shares of stock and real estate would be pulled upward because this money would be moved from fixed income assets into equities and property or into precious metals. So it might drive up the price of gold and or silver or platinum or titanium or whatever other rare minerals are being purchased and sold and traded. So there are a lot of issues associated with how the government might retire this debt using MMT policies and what the ramifications would be. So one, it's not a silver bullet. It is a potential tool that could be utilized with some understanding of what the side effects would be. Now, what about income supplements? Well, income supplements to people who have lost employment caused by systemic crises, I think is certainly warranted and necessary. Most people would have nothing against helping people out who have lost their income and are now unemployed and are facing eviction from their apartment or foreclosure on their property. As Keynes argued, government has to step in when private sector spending contracts and millions of people lose their income. What our government has failed to address is the need for systemic reforms that are required to prevent the recurrence of the conditions and that really guarantee that the cycle will again peak and crash. So pouring all this money even into people's hands who need it is needed, but it is not a fix. At best, it is a short-term Band-Aid, and it props up the system a bit until the next crisis comes around. And I go back to Harry Gunnison Brown now. He authored an economic textbook that went through quite a few editions in the early to mid part of the 20th century. And as I revealed above, he was one of the few economists of his era with a sound understanding of land markets and the impact the taxation policies had on the business cycle. And these insights he acquired in large measure by studying Henry George's works. In his analysis of the causes of the Great Depression, here's what Brown had to say. To those now guiding the affairs of our country, it is either a matter of no importance at all or else it is a matter for congratulation that a majority of our people must pay a minority for the very permission to work and live on the earth in any except extremely undesirable locations. Yeah, there's still free land, but can you live off that land? Is there water? Are there natural resources? Can you grow food? What happens if you live in a rural town in the United States that has lost its employment base, and not only are most of the stores shut down, but the last medical facility is gone? So you're in a small town in rural America and you're a senior citizen with health conditions. It might be 2-hour drive in an automobile to get to the next hospital. And we're experiencing all kinds of challenges that way across this country. So Brown expected very little of real consequence back then from the Roosevelt administration and its economic advisors. He concluded in his writing, he said, "The fact that the masses of our people from one end of our country to the other must pay heavy taxes in their food and clothing bills in order to relieve landowners of taxes on the community produced value of their land does not seem to concern them." And it is somewhat surprising, and I haven't been able to figure this out historically, because one of Roosevelt's advisors was Raymond Moley. And Raymond Moley, who was a professor of political science at Columbia University, was also familiar with Henry George. And while during the Great Depression, he didn't really say much about it, later in his life, he did write in support of land value taxation at the local level. But there's no evidence I can find that he ever had a conversation with Franklin Roosevelt about, this idea that maybe we ought to try to do something to tame the land markets and take a look at Henry George's proposals. That just wasn't part of his thinking. Brown was resurrecting Henry George in his arguments against all taxation, save for the public collection of rents. Doing so, Brown argued, would remove the burden of taxation, as this poster says, that binds the people. So again, the challenge was, and still is, to get government to recognize under law the distinction between income earned by producing goods and services and income derived by privileges secured and protected by unjust law. And it's just very difficult, because we have grown to accept the idea that it is just and rightful to own part of nature, to claim for ourselves the ownership of some part of nature. Brown wrote a paper in 1936 that was published by the American Academy of Political and Social Science that contained a challenge to his fellow economists and others to consider the very real benefits of doing exactly what Henry George called for, the collection of location rents as a primary source of public revenue. And remember, this Brown is not at the margin of the discipline. He's someone who got his PhD at Yale University under Irving Fisher. So he has the credentials. In the same way that I've said that Richard Wolff has the credentials to sit at the table with other economists. And as Jim quoted Joe Stiglitz, so does Stiglitz. We have to hope that these ideas start to percolate up from just isolated, references, and that make us feel, those of us who embrace these ideas, feel warm and fuzzy, like there's some hope for change, into a regular, ongoing discussion that makes it to the media. So we hear about this discussion on the nightly business report. We hear about it, on NPR when they talk. That's National Public Radio in the U.S. and in other venues where the public gets to hear these ideas. So, you know, back in this early article in 1936, Brown writes, I find that I am sometimes spoken of as a single taxer by persons who are opposed to the single tax, while some of the thoroughgoing single taxers profess themselves not wholly satisfied with my orthodoxy. The truth is that I recognize the fundamental justice and common sense of the single tax idea, but that any other tax than a tax on land values is always and everywhere wrong, regardless of public needs or the nature of this other tax, I do not maintain. He's talking practical, you know, incremental need to change. Yes, we need to move toward the perfect, but the perfect can be the enemy of the good. And we need to think about how we can incrementally move toward the perfect. We've done that at the local level with the two-rate property tax, encouraging communities that once they put it into place, to keep moving in the right direction, keep removing the tax burden from property improvements, and keep increasing the amount of tax on land values. Brown finishes up with this. He says, but that the annual rental value of land should be eventually almost entirely appropriated by the public in taxation, and that it should be the chief source, even though not necessarily the only source of public revenue, I am thoroughly convinced. For those of you who are on or with me who don't know anything about, you know, this idea of land value taxation, there is this one rather important technical thing or consideration. We now tax land at the local level based on an assessment of its market value, meaning its selling price. In theory, the full collection of the annual rental value of a location would eliminate any potential for there to be income derived by owning that parcel of land. So there's no income stream to be capitalized into a selling price. So land prices under this scheme, if fully adopted, could possibly fall to close to zero. And that's a real challenge because of a lot of what I've covered already in the previous lectures, and that is to a significant percentage of households in the United States and in other countries, a major portion of net worth is the capitalized rent of land, the land value. The savings that I mentioned earlier are minimal. This is the asset that people have, and justice is going to require them to lose that value. It has to be replaced elsewhere, and so we need some other measures to ease that transition. And again, the long-term effect is going to stabilize the economic cycle. It's going to minimize these opportunities for shocks to bring us to a crash position. And so the expectation is if we do the right things and keep doing them more and more, then people's savings will increase, people's incomes will increase, people will become less and less dependent on the public sector for their support. How long that would take? Well, it depends on how quickly we are able to bring about at least some changes in our tax structure and our other systemic reforms that are needed. Well, getting back to a time of the past, I dug out this photograph that has a group of supporters of Henry George together. And in the early part of the 20th century, they were starting to feel optimistic that they might be successful in gaining public support. But then, of course, world events intervened. And there was no time for debates over tax reform or public policy reforms while people were fighting the First World War. And during the 1920s, there wasn't much interest in the ideas as well, because there was this feeling of prosperity. It wasn't universal. It was hollow, but we call the 20s in the United States the Roaring 20s. That proved to be a false hope. The 1920s were not a sign of the future. It was a sign that stresses were increasing and then another crash was going to occur. And when the crash occurred, again, as I said, someone like Raymond Moley, having the ear of Franklin Roosevelt, they were looking at property values collapsing all around the country. And so looking to land as a basis for reform of the tax structure seemed impractical. You know, how can we impose a higher rate of tax on land values when land values are collapsing? And then the Keynesian revolution took hold in the late 1930s and put us on the path as we are on now. So those economists who agreed with Henry George found themselves isolated within their discipline. And this is the subject of a book that was written in 1994, co-authored by Mason Gaffney, who died last year. He was an economist, a long-term economist at the University of California. It was co-authored by Fred Harrison, an economic commentator and colleague of ours in the United Kingdom. And I will leave you tonight with just a few sentences from what Mason Gaffney wrote in this book, The Corruption of Economics. He tells us, few people realize to what degree the founders of neoclassical economics changed the discipline for the express purpose of deflecting George and frustrating future students seeking to follow his arguments. The strategy was semantic, to destroy the very words in which he expressed himself. In a sense, what Mason was saying is that those who had a vested interest in hiding the insights into how our economy really worked had a lot of money behind them, and they set out to do it very specifically. And one of their strategies was to ensure that economists who would become chairs of the departments of the major universities in the country would be willing to teach neoclassical economics as a way to protect their interests. That's a pretty blunt, charge by Mason Gaffney, but in the book, he provides considerable evidence to confirm that conclusion. So I will end my lecture with that tonight and open it up to any comments or questions, and we'll pick up from here next week. Victor, I see your yellow hand up.
Basically, can you argue that someone like Zuckerberg or Bezos got their wealth from land, or was it just basically printed on the stock market?
Well, let's. Amazon lost money for a very long time. You have to give Bezos a lot of credit for convincing investors to be patient. Well, his business model expanded and took advantage of the changes in technology that when he started were still not firmly established. So I'd like to see Bezos contribute to public funding in a meaningful way. And my way of getting him to do that would be to impose on all businesses a graduated tax on gross revenue and scrap all of the detailed parts of our corporate income tax or business profits tax.
Exactly, but you're proposing a very narrow solution. You're proposing a solution based on land valuation, whereas I think the real solution is to eliminate the oligarchs who are essentially printing money. In other words, that this,
Well,
until you remove the oligarchs, nothing's going to change.
yeah, well, the question is how you remove them. I mean, do you make it less possible for individuals to acquire such huge fortunes? And I would argue that can be done by changes in law that improve competitive forces and eliminate what is right now the fundamental redistribution of income and wealth, and that is the redistribution of income from producers to non-producers. And so there's no one silver bullet here, Victor. As I proceed through this series of lectures, I'll highlight a number of other things that I think should be done simultaneously. And part of it is we need political reforms too. There are many issues. Just the United States Constitution, for example, was adopted, and the states, approved the Constitution in 1792, right? Yeah, 92 or 93. But there have been 33 amendments since then, because they realized at the Constitutional Convention, as Benjamin Franklin said, we have a republic, madam, if we can keep it. And they compromised in principle. And some of the principles that they compromised were extremely important. And they compromised on the land issue, because they did debate during the Constitution the idea of imposing a tax on landed property. But Madison and others thought that they did not have the technology to accurately assess land or the governmental framework to collect it. So they let it go. And so we still have a lot of work to do on the political side as well as the economic policy side, in my view.
Well, again, the frame of reference, though, is if you believe we're a republic, there might be one type of solution. If you accept that we're in fact an oligarchy, then there's another. And I think that's a very key issue here, because the original founders, the Federalists, I could argue, were oligarchs, and that we reverted back to an oligarchy.
Well, they certainly were good at defending their self-interest.
Right. So
and
topic for longer discussion.
Yeah, if the result, certainly we have never been a democracy. We have operated as a republic, and the definition of republic, as I understand it, is a society governed by laws. The laws necessarily aren't just or unjust. We have to deal with that, on an ongoing basis, and we're dealing with that right now on the basis of an ideological split in our population. We have people who think very differently about what the nature of just law is and the role of our government in society, as opposed to the role and responsibility of individuals. So I think it may be that we have succumbed to being close to an oligarchy, and maybe we are by the criteria that you would put forward. But we're not. I think we still have hope. And my hope is that our political process will allow for discourse and debate and potential for positive change.
Well, I'll come back and haunt you on this in the future. Thank you for the presentation, though.
Jim, I think you were next.
Mr. Looney has correctly pointed out that the Constitutional Convention occurred in 1787.
But it was adopted. It wasn't finally adopted until 92 or 3 by all the states.
I thought it was adopted in 1788, June 21, 1788.
You mean when Rhode Island finally signed?
I don't know what the order of signature was.
Okay. All right.
But the interesting thing about the Constitution is that I'm getting a feedback. I'll shut up.
Wayne, you need to mute yourself, my friend.
The Constitution is an interesting document if one thinks about it in the context of the assertion by the Nobel laureate in economics. I'm blanking on his name, Kahneman from Princeton University. He got the Nobel Prize in 2002. And he said the errors of a theory are rarely to be found in what the theory states explicitly. They hide rather in what it omits or tacitly assumes. If you look at the U.S.
Jim, you muted yourself. We still can't hear you.
Still can't hear you. This is Wayne. I'll be unmuted. I want to mention that. Can you hear me?
We can. Well, Jim didn't finish yet, Wayne. So you need to.
He muted himself. Okay, I'll mute.
I don't know how I got muted, but what I was saying is that the errors of several errors of the U.S. Constitution are errors because of omission or tacit assumption. And two of the most glaring errors of that ilk are that women may not vote or hold office, and that slavery is legal unless an individual state outlaws it. But there's another glaring error, and that is that North America belongs to white male Europeans who have every right to take it away from the Native Americans. And the whole concept and mindset of land speculation has been a part of this country since 1607, and it was incorporated into the Constitution without one word having been written about it in 1788 or 1787, and then ratified in 1788.
Yeah, the early generations of Europeans who came here, they certainly came here with a desire for and a hunger for owning land. And then they found that they could gain a lot of it and become fairly wealthy by finding tenants who would work for them. Natural, I mean, this is human nature, right? And the fact that we first had that all the European societies that these people came from had laws that advantaged landed interests shouldn't surprise us that they succumbed to those instincts. Wayne, you are now. Okay.
I'm muted. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was going to say George Washington was actually elected president in 1788. He took office in early 1789 and served 2 terms. So it was a little bit earlier than you said. That's all.
Okay. I just couldn't remember how long the state debates occurred before the final. I think Rhode Island was, Delaware was the first, Rhode Island was the last. Before, when did someone maybe can find out when did Rhode Island finally approve the U.S. Constitution? Marty.
Yeah, excellent class. What I wanted to say was really something that I wanted Ibrahima to give me the go-ahead to talk about the class I have coming up.
Well, let me get to Joe first, and then you will have our last word tonight, Marty, so you can tell everyone what you have coming.
Marty, we have one more session of ed coming up.
Okay.
Yeah.
You want me to wait? Okay.
Yeah.
Joe.
Yeah, great evening as always. Learned a lot, and just want to mention that Keynes, he might not have, done what he should have done with the land, but he did say that we should euthanize the rentiers.
Yes.
But I'm not sure exactly the details of that, but
yeah.
I like the sentiment.
Well, I don't know. I mean, look, is it the landowner who's evil, or is it the system that's evil? I mean, if I had ask for a show of hands, how many of you ever owned an investment property? Well, I mean, I don't see anything evil in owning investment properties. Now, one could say that there's a good deal of opportunistic greed that's been exploited in the last several years, at least in the rental markets, where a lot of people have just jacked up the rents charged to tenants well above any reasonable profit margins. On the other hand, there have been many people who own investment properties who have lost a lot because their tenants lost their employment, couldn't pay for a long time. There was a moratorium. Their costs continued to increase. So these are very touchy, in my view, very touchy judgment calls about what we should do under the circumstances of the existing system. And so, while somebody like Jeff Bezos and the enormous amount of income that individual has acquired, in a truly just system probably wouldn't happen. What do we do? I mean, what's the fairest thing to do for everyone who exists in the system? What sort of incremental reforms can we put into place that will deal with what Victor thinks is an oligarchy? And we do have an increasing number of individuals who are now billionaires, and the prospects for someone becoming the first world trillionaire. I'm recalling a line from Heather Remoff's new book, talking about the fact that the evolution of our species somehow came to a point where we justified in our own minds the acquisition of property far beyond our immediate needs or our future needs, or even the future needs of our descendants. And this becomes a sort of game of just accounting. It's like, I can claim that I am the third richest person in the United States or third richest person in the world, because that additional wealth, what does it mean to you when you have that much wealth? Some of those individuals put that excess wealth, even though it may not have been fully earned, to good public purpose. Give you an example on the land issue. You have somebody like Ted Turner, who has never had a great reputation for his business ethics. But what has he done with a lot of his wealth? Well, he's used it to acquire a huge amount of land. What has he done with the land he's acquired? He's returned it to its natural condition. And as a result, the ecosystems have recovered. The variety of plants and animal species that live on that land have recovered, whereas it was at one time dominated by cattle or sheep. So he's done something that many people feel is the right thing to do, to reduce the human footprint on the planet. Is he paying the full rental value of that land to the communities where it's located? Probably not. I guess with that, I've stunned everyone into silence. Any final thoughts, comments before we break tonight? Well, then, thank you all for joining me, and we'll meet again next Wednesday for some more vigorous discussion. And I welcome all the comments that you've made to join us, and I'll turn it over to Marty.
And Marty will make his little teaser on the last session.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
Okay. Bye all.